Can't wait.
Move the box onto the table. That would make more sense.
That would make more sense.
Look at the ethereal light he gets as he stands up.
Right, are we all ready?
We're all ready.
How angry you're going to get. I don't know if you're going to flip the papers.
Okie dokie. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, nobody is more aware of the exquisite boredom that a speech can bring in, as I've often seen it on your faces, that emotion. So this speech I've endeavoured to be as brief as possible, to have as little window dressing as possible, and to rather get straight to the matter at hand. Though I hope you do understand that there is rather a lot to say on the matter. That said, I'll stop wasting time on this exordium, but I beseech you, please listen to what I have to say. Seriously listen. Challenge your preconceived notions. Because I think if only you will listen and consider my argument fully, then you'll be sufficiently convinced of my view. Now then, Athens and Sparta, those two titans of ancient Greece. What can be said of them? The latter, an insular, secluded, unchanging people. The former, a cosmopolitan, curious, inventive society. Ask yourselves, which society do we see around us today? Are we not in this very building receiving an Athenian education of Athenian subjects, reading in this very subject an Athenian-sponsored source? Are we not, in this island, the products of that crucible of civilization which sprung up in Attica all those centuries ago? Granted, however, one might see remnants of Sparta in our society today, in the xenophobic anti-immigration protests, and in ribald football hooligans, which are, of course, equally valuable as the things I mentioned earlier. And I'm sure Mr. Colbeck and his associates swell with pride every time that they see mindless street violence, for that is this country's inheritance from Sparta. Let us examine the achievements of Athens and Athenians. Democracy, philosophy, architecture, law. Are these things... there's a great deal more as well. Are these things not valuable beyond measure? Are these things what give to life all of its allure and its wondrousness? For democracy frees the individual to do what he will with life, to be the master of his own destiny. And philosophy, which Cicero called the guide of our lives, the explorer of all that is good in us, the exterminator of all evil, allows man to tackle the greatest problems within and beyond himself. Architecture gives us the tools to construct great monuments and palaces, to direct the very physical world around us to our betterment, dwellings in which to house our families, and temples in which to glorify our shared institutions. And law, which allows us to pay homage to that most precious virtue, justice. These things are the foundation of all that we know and hold dear. And then, Athens, it will be found, has been at the forefront of each of these disciplines. For was not democracy in its purest form the results of the labours of the great Cleisthenes? Was not philosophy in its infancy established by Socrates? Was not architecture spearheaded by Ictinus and Callicrates, who designed that marvel of the Parthenon which still draws millions of visitors today? And was not law the product, in its present polished form, of the labours of Draco and Solon, who brought order to the chaos of man and led by their example to a safer and more peaceful world? Are these not incontrovertible truths? It is surely to be found in all of these and many more areas of wisdom and greatness that Athenians have bequeathed to us a legacy that cannot be valued with all the wealth of the earth. Would any of us have had the lives we lead and enjoy today without the pioneering efforts of Athenians? And then, what may be said for Sparta, ladies and gentlemen? What has Sparta left to us? In fact, perhaps more importantly, where is Sparta today? Because while Athens is still the capital city of the Greek state, Sparta is hardly included on a modern map of the country. And just as all that Sparta the city left to us is ruins, all that Sparta the culture left to us is the carcass of a defunct way of life. I put it to you, ladies and gentlemen, that the truly great civilizations last. And in the few cases that they do not, they are often cut down by the sword of another. Spartan fate was far more embarrassing than any military defeat could have been. For Spartan culture cannibalized its population, so that when the Romans sought to conquer Greece, they did not even bother to stop in Sparta. For by the 2nd century BC, it was an insignificant village of about 1,000 men. Such was the oliganthropia of their people. Sparta's own isolationist and defensive policies can leave us in no doubt at all that the fall of Sparta was entirely her own fault. For would Mr. Colbeck not argue hereafter how ingenious the Spartan army was and how successful the Spartans were at defending their homeland? Either way he loses, for if he admits Sparta fell to outside forces, then he admits that Sparta's main focus on the army was for naught. But if he doubles down and says Sparta was so glorious as to be undefeated, then the blame for their destruction lies entirely upon their shoulders. Good cultures ought not to destroy themselves, or busy themselves with working towards the task of piling high the bodies of their citizens in bloody massacre. The Spartan poet Tertius's famous line goes, "Do not be so in love with life." Yet when one sees the results of his mindset, I should like to tell him not to be so in love with death. Because it is absolutely clear that the Spartan relationship with death is almost cult-like in its sickening, violent passion. Terry Deary, author of Horrible Histories, was right when he called the Spartans the ungrooviest lot in all of Greece. However, let me be clear that I do not oppose all that Sparta stood for. The Spartan constitution is certainly praiseworthy and has received approbation from such men as the aforementioned Cicero, as well as the prominent Athenian Xenophon, to whom, not coincidentally, we owe a great deal of gratitude for committing much of the knowledge of Sparta to posterity. As, of course, no Spartan worth his pig's blood and vinegar would think of doing such a thing. But apart from the constitution, a dedication to tradition and freedom, albeit not for the helots, as well as undeniable feats of courage, oftentimes erring a bit closer to stupidity and recklessness, are aspects of Spartan culture I do not intend to gainsay. But what else can be said in favour of Sparta that I do not approve of, because it's not as clear-cut as all that? I do not suspect I can penetrate the mind of Mr. Colbeck, but the arguments he may raise to defend his chosen city of knaves and brutes, I suspect are to show that he is as sorry a victim to the Spartan mirage as any man living. For if I were to praise one thing about Sparta above all else, it would be their capacity for propagandising, which has pervaded perceptions of them ever since ancient times. It is so typical of Colbeck, Homeric devotee that he is, to fall for a load of myths. One of the most invaluable tools in the Spartan propaganda arsenal is that of misleading terminology, for time and again have I heard that society referred to in terms so improper as to almost constitute misinformation. For example, the myth that the Spartans were the world's first communists. The only extent to which this could be true is if we consider the Juche regime of North Korea to be a true version of Marx's dream. Oh, but they were called the homoioi, he will say, which means equals, and they cared not for possessions or wealth, and they shared all the land between them. Well, this is true enough, but not only was Sparta still effectively an oligarchy, with wealth and with the wealthy and connected maintaining control of the Gerousia, but also private property still existed, and bribery still took place in politics. Moreover, even if all this were not true, even if the Spartiates were living in a perfect socialist utopia, it could only be so due to the oppression and subjugation of hundreds of thousands of fellow Greek helot slaves. A less communist idea I cannot conceive. And may I add that the barbaric treatment of those helots is shameful in its own right, and far outdoes any other Greek states. For of course they all relied upon slavery, but never of fellow Greeks. A further point I shall mention, but not dwell upon, is the misnomer that Sparta was a society of perfect gender equality. While Spartan inheritance law was engineered towards women and as wives received their late husband's property, it would be completely wrong, in my view, to compare this to women's liberation. Rather, women were still controlled by a patriarchal society, but the roles they were forced into look more like the liberated roles women choose to fulfill today. For example, Spartan government was still completely exclusive to men, as was the army. If it's something closer to gender equality you want, then Persia is where you need to go, because they allowed women in both of these fields. And while on the topic, I'll just mention that Athenian women did have property rights over their personal effects and slaves. But all this is to sidestep the most emphasised part of the Spartan mirage, the legend of the Spartan army. Oh, those noble soldiers, Mr. Colbeck the expert will exclaim, who would outrank an Athenian army any day. Those Spartans who didn't deign to appear at Marathon when the very security of Greece lay in the balance, but Colbeck says they were noble, and Colbeck's an expert. Those Spartans who allowed their king to march to his certain destruction at Thermopylae and would not leave Laconia for fear. But Colbeck says they're noble, and Colbeck's an expert. Those Spartans who dithered away valuable weeks, hoping that their wall across the isthmus would be built before the Persians got too near for comfort, cowering in their peninsula. What the hell was that? But Colbeck says they were noble, and Colbeck, sure enough, is an expert. Spartan military history is a litany of defeat, cowardice, religious ceremonial pretexts like the Carnea and the Hyacinthia, and more defeats dressed up as glorious victories. Plataea is perhaps the only... Oh, it's my cuffling. Plataea is perhaps the only instance Sparta proved her reputation. But think of all the times Athens exceeded Sparta. Marathon saw them fight with 3-1 odds in bad conditions and still pull off a victory. Through tactical cunning. Cape Artemisium, which although it was a defeat, was not an annihilation like at Thermopylae. And Salamis, a perfect demonstration of Athenian naval brilliance. And let it not be forgotten that the most vile, cowardly plot to hide behind a wall and let the rest of Greece fall to Persia, which was only avoided by Athens bluffing to make a deal with the Persians. We know from their response to Alexander I of Macedon that they would never make such a deal. The Spartans delayed time and again in the most cowardly fashion imaginable, under the belief that they would be safe behind their newly completed wall. But the fact is that without Athenian naval supremacy, Spartan infantry brilliance would count for nothing. Herodotus is very clear in his judgment that Greece was saved by the Athenians, and though his bias will be pointed out to me, his rationale is watertight. Notwithstanding, For no matter how much the Spartans fortified the isthmus, no matter how much they built up their wall, without Athenian naval support, they would eventually have fallen. Their allies would have deserted them, victims to the Persian navy, and without the Athenian navy, there could have been no Thermopylae, no Salamis, no Mycale, and the Spartans would be forced either to die gloriously in battle or make terms with Xerxes' army. For all their martial bluster, Sparta comes out as totally reliant on Athenian sea and land power. Once more, the Spartan mirage crumbles when treated with reason. And now, as my speech draws to its close, as I'm sure you're all very glad, I ask you, how would a Spartan decide the outcome of this debate? Well, he would have dispensed with this speech minutes ago, and he would have had us two fight to the death. And I expect some of you may be thinking, oh, what a relief it would be to have Finley shut up for a while. But I implore you, put aside this jest and seriously put yourselves in the shoes of a Spartan schoolchild. Adolescence is a difficult enough part of life, as I'm sure many of you will know, and I implore you all, if it's not too horrible, to think of the lowest point at which you have ever been, your darkest hour, the hardest challenge you've had to face. Now imagine having to fight for your life at the same time. Imagine waking up not knowing if today is the day that you get bludgeoned to death by the bigger children in your class, while the others cheer and the teachers do nothing but pass criticism on the murderer's technique. Oh, horribly messy, Jenkins. You've pulled his eyes out, but he's still flailing around. You should try and crush his head in one go, really. Try again on the next one. Imagine for me you've had something precious stolen and you run to the nearest policeman and ask for help. And he asks, well, did you see the chap who did it? And you reply, well, no, he was rather too quick. And the policeman says, oh, well, that is obviously your fault. You didn't see him. He's done nothing wrong. That's on you. I ask anyone today who has support for Sparta on his or her lips to dust off that sense of empathy, which has clearly been so cruelly neglected, to sit for a moment and to imagine the brutish and horrible lives that many Spartans of all ages have to suffer, sleeping on thistles, bathing only 5 times a year, being hurled into the wilderness at a tender age, being deprived of clothing in even the cruelest cold, going hungry in the hills. And if you can consider these hardships and still conclude that Sparta was a better society than Athens, then I invite you, cast off those Athenian trappings so imposed on you by your lives, burn your clothes, destroy your possessions, drop out of college, go homeless until adulthood, steal food and drink to survive, and sleep in the woods with the beasts. If you will not do this, then are you not the worst kind of hypocrite? If Spartan living truly was superior, are these not the things you would do? Consider this always, as well as those emotions of terror upon which the whole of Spartan society was built. For what is a society truly worth if it is built on those emotions? And that is for the homoi. I speak not of the terrorism exerted on the Helots. These enormities found real human victims, like me, like you, like any of us, and that is never something to be glossed over, as he will try and make you do. Fear doesn't change. Remember that.